I want to thank everybody for coming out on such a nice fall day. There's plenty of other things I know we could all be doing. Just to kind of lay the groundwork for this exhibition before we dive into the conversation with Michael, as Katie mentioned for this show, Fugitive Land, one of the ways into it that I was thinking about was really about place, site, location, history. So for Bose's work, was very interested in how he was really thinking and critiquing his own experience of growing up in Baguio City, which was built by the American colonizers in this day, and was using a lot of that kind of material, found printed matter, to really critique what that experience and kind of trauma and history is. And related to that, with Stephanie Syjuco's work, her 3-channel film is looking back to 3 Vietnam War films made in Hollywood that were shot in the Philippines. And she likes to kind of think about this in the context of it being filmed at the site of a former American colony to tell a story of another American war. And that kind of ironic duality that's there, but then also essentially redacting much of those films in order to tease out these aspects of history that get obscured through Hollywood, essentially. And so that becomes the backdrop to then kind of invite Michael in, and we're just so excited that not only do we have his beautiful silver paintings, which we'll speak about, but also this opportunity to create new work. And I think that's also something that was just really kind of exciting, and we're so appreciative of all of Silverlens that we could do something at this ambitious scale and weight as well. And maybe that's a good way to start, Michael, is to speak about what is this and its own relation to these ideas of place.
Yeah, thanks, Chris, and thanks to the gallery for supporting such a kind of large, unlikely, ambitious endeavor. And what we are looking at is basically a displacement of land underground, of space. In about 2014 or 15, I started working kind of more closely, examining a fault line that formed the East Coast when North America, Africa, and Europe all collided. And so this fault line, basically, in tracing it through the Bronx, continuing up through Connecticut into Vermont, ends in a kind of end, so to speak, in an entire marble mountain in Danby Quarry. So this is taken out of the Danby Quarry mine, which is essentially the largest underground marble mine in the world. This is entire mine made of marble. And so I'd been taking out 200,000-pound blocks and cutting their contiguous sides to kind of look at landscape that's subterranean, in a way, landscape that's uncontestable, and landscapes that are below us that form the fabric of our, the base of our reality. So this is essentially one slab that is saw cut on one side, important to me, and also then on the other side, if you've noticed yet, polished and then treated with a photographic process of silvering based upon like silver gelatin printing and laboratory mirror glass making that reveals, again, all of the texture and surfaces and is highly reflective. So it's kind of a photographic process of an image in a way. And in a sense, I wanted to make a billboard, signage of this displacement of land. And ideas of landscape, obviously, they're buried in maybe the abstract imagery of the marble's folds, as well as a landscape, perhaps, not only that you couldn't access underground, but above a landscape that you almost aspired to or couldn't reach representationally. Because when it is outside or in the gallery, it reflects a space that's above our heads and kind of beyond our sight lines.
So much of your work does touch on photography, but then what it depicts is not, say, a recognizable or a representational image, or in this case, I think it's so interesting to think about it as it's a landscape format of this horizontal, but doesn't depict any landscape, but then is of the land, and that kind of refusal that you're playing with.
Yeah, it is definitely of the land. I mean, there's a kind of implication of inaccessibility, right? Because it is underground, it's kind of very ahuman. And in a lot of my work, I am very interested in looking at things that we haven't considered as part of the fabric of our reality, something that's more holistic in terms of how we see material intelligence, how we see things beyond our own kind of immediate knowledge, and that are kind of abstract. I'm super interested in the space in this, that it might be abstracted, as in kind of Korean or Asian brushwork, right? I was always super interested in the landscape and how that's depicted with an almost inaccessible, often kind of foreground.
It's like a lack of perspective.
Lack of perspective, a totally different way of looking at space and perspective, and some of that is referenced here. And but beyond the idea that there's territory implied, it's kind of spatial territory that's not yet been designated. It is being extracted, but it's not been kind of bordered and cut, and in a way, I guess it's not been constructed in that sense. And so I was very interested in displacing that and putting it up into this sightline.
Yeah, I think it's interesting to think of the literal kind of stone itself as what's presented, and maybe we should also clarify, and we'll get into these videos, but what this projection is and how it is and isn't part of the work.
Yeah, I mean, just back to the silvering process, I think, I do see these as very photographic works, despite the fact that this might look to and, reference painting, and that this marble might reference an object that but also a sculptural kind of process. But essentially I wanted to use an image-making process to make a non-image. The silver nitrate paintings that we look at are actually done in very liminal spaces, either architectural or kind of constructed. I do them in DMZs, contested islands of Dokdo, for instance, between Japan and Korea. Abandoned factories in Brooklyn, Red Hook, or as in the front painting in the New York farm colony, which is a kind of ruin that was basically the model for the first New York work and poorhouse. And so I go into these spaces with a treated canvas and do a pull with an epoxy to take an impression, a squeegee, and that impression in the transparent epoxy has to set for 3 days. So after 72 hours of curing, if the piece is still there, because a lot of times the pieces are either fugitive, get trashed, or end up with all kinds of detritus in them, I'll take it back to the studio and then develop it in space with this kind of photographic chemistry, and that'll reveal, when it's metallizing, when it drops out the silver, reveal any traces to me and kind of accentuate the image. At the same time, it brings my image or our image and the presence of the space into kind of collision with that. So I think the energy of that space, and it's kind of receiving not only the history of place, the kind of material atmospheric experience, it also gets an experience of time. And so that experience to me is in a way merged with the present once that silver nitrate reflects light and brings us into the image as well as the space. So these are both really different kinds of displacements to me. And in a way, the idea that there's a service of an image that is, a vehicle we use to kind of record time and our presence and our place is just used to record a slower time, a slower recognizability, and kind of change the way that we kind of perceive maybe indexicality.
It's also a little bit of I think, hacking photography in that sense.
Totally.
Right?
Yeah.
It's like unpacking those processes, slowing them down, what would happen in a black and white dark room over minutes or hours, you're doing it for days or longer. Mm-hmm. And I think also that reference to what is the index or what is the kind of, where the image is derived from and moving across these mediums is really kind of, it's transfer. I mean, you speak about it also in terms of almost alchemy, right?
Yeah, kind of. I mean, there's a kind of alchemical part of it, but I also think what's significant to me is that it's very factual and it's very much about how things behave, but rewiring and hacking, as you say, they're normal ends, or the ends that we think that we're achieving. I mean, to me, I watch the material and learn from it as well, and sometimes the meaning comes out of that process. Yeah.
And how are you selecting these sites?
The sites are usually places that I think are liminal, places as we think of them, places that are either coming or going. I mean, places that are contested, constructed. I'm interested in places like, for instance, the DMZ, which, although it is a constructed space, I'm really interested in the communities and that actually develop around it, the things that are real, the things that are actually not constructs, but that actually are very much, a part of the fabric of that actual reality.
And maybe that's a good segue to talk about some of the videos that we're screening right onto the marble billboard. So the videos, to clarify, is very much an intervention into the exhibition and the sculpture. So if you come on any day but today, you will see the room with the lights on and the marble and its veining without this projector and the videos running. But we've purposely selected 3 of Michael's video works that are really about very particular places. And as a way to kind of extend the ideas of the exhibition. And one of them is a project we did on the DMZ, so maybe we can start with that.
Yeah, actually, yeah, and the other sites that we're talking about are either sites of economic change, abandoned mansions in Barcelona, for instance, the New York Farm Colony, you know, this poorhouse kind of model that's also being slated for renewal right now. And for instance, the DMZ or contested islands we're talking about. You know, when Chris asked to do a video program or to try to do some kind of, you know, event or programming, I thought about one of the earliest reasons I was interested in making this a billboard form and why frame this kind of piece of land up in the air. And one of the other kind of displacements I remember, you know, really distinctly growing up in the Midwest was the kind of phenomenon of these drive-ins across the landscape. And, you know, sometimes when I was in Minnesota, I remember driving out to find, you know, space and you know, basically kind of get out of the confines of where I was. I would go to this one site near the airport, and the drive-in movies there that would cut out the landscape, or a kind of excision of that landscape, almost this place of light and space. And to have airplanes flying in and out in front of, behind that space was quite, you know, affecting. So I thought it was really a nice opportunity to get to screen and try to show these video works onto a surface like that, almost as a kind of, you know, reference to that. But back in maybe 10 years ago, in my old studio in Red Hook, I used to do this series of experimental screenings and videos along with some friends of mine, Matthew Barney and Lucy Raven, Tavares Strawn. We would just get together and basically try to create a platform where we could screen videos for each other that were in progress, that weren't really like, you know, meant to be shown. And so one of the experiments that I had done at one of these screenings was to actually project onto one of the marble billboards that I was working on from this series. And so this was a nice opportunity to kind of try to reinvestigate that or revisit that. And the videos that we've chosen for this, or that I wanted to kind of take a look at, I'm seeing them for the first time as well, because I've never shown these pieces. But what you're looking at now is a piece called Circannual Rhythm. I'll keep it super short because there's such dense videos, it's kind of crazy. And this was from a group of period of time when I was working in Alaska. About 7 years I spent working with a kind of Inupiat whaling community up in Barrow, Alaska. And I was also looking at the idea of a landscape that would be changing. So I was thinking a lot about the land strait that used to cross Europe, for instance, the migration of people, and also the idea that this community lived on a landscape that was always changing physically, seasonally, almost a kind of place that was always in flux.
And you turned it into like a performance, right?
Yeah, and so this was a performance kind of piece with a series of events. It was originally a 9-channel video that's 50 feet long, which we showed at the Bowen Foundation, 2006, I think. And essentially it showed me over a period of several months walking the Dalton Highway, which is basically the feeder road between Fairbanks and the only service road that crosses the tundra up to the oil fields at Prudhoe Bay. The reality of the Inupiat people at the North Shore is that I found it incredibly science fiction. You know, the idea that it was very much about subsistence and traditional kind of existence, but also very futuristic. I mean, they were renting land to the oil companies, you know, and so there's this very different kind of reality of what real estate was, land was, what was extractive, and the idea of scale. And so in this video at the center, I basically walked the 400-mile stretch at mile intervals, being filmed coming and going at various points along each of these microclimates. until I reached the Prudhoe Bay. And so what you see is me coming and going, but the conceit was I would want it to follow the Alaskan pipeline. So basically I followed the Trans-Alaska pipeline against its energy flow, recording the number of calories that I spent so that we could come up with the kind of equation or the conclusion that it would take 0.000139, calories per millisecond to actually walk against that flow as a human. So the idea of scale and changing scales and shifting our intimacies with it, and energy against geologic energy, against desire, and what that is, what's scalable, and all the while a very meditative process. Well, I kind of deteriorated. I had a very limited set of food and water, and I was transported. I was thinking a lot about a hack or a mashup of the Joseph Beuys performance where he was brought into America on an ambulance in a stretcher, never touched the soil, and they got to the gallery and lived with a coyote for 3 days and was taken back in the same way. So in this video, in a kind of very not tongue-in-cheek way, but a decided way, I was transported in the back of a trailer. And so I was blind to every new vista. And then each time I would see a new vista, walk it, and then be recorded.
But there's also, connections, I feel, to your scientific training, because with all these measurements, which goes back to a lot of your early work in the 90s, where you're also, calculating caloric expenditures, or if I recall correctly, there's like a piece where you're trying to collect or estimate the total caloric expenditure of someone like Genghis Khan, right?
Yeah, it's one of that kind of figure in speculative reality is super important to me. I'm really interested in how art's so difficult to metricize that it's kind of impossible to get a metric of that nature. And yet, an aspect of science, one aspect in its language is to kind of find some of those metrics, And so I was very interested in kind of merging those together.
And also using your own body in this case for...
Yeah, and in that sense, some of these speculative realities that are shown on the other sides of this video 9 channel, the walk up to Prudhoe Bay is shown in the middle, but flanking it on either side are 3 kind of channels that show 2 different sets of actions that I set up that were also both real and speculative. So on the right side, I worked with a number of Inupiat local actors in Point Barrow. And basically, we drove out into the tundra about several hours to a site that Disney had used for a production about Inupiat culture. It's basically very fictionalized, very kind of dramatized place that the locals all called Hollywood. So I heard about this place called Hollywood, and essentially it's a big sod community, or small sod community that was a set that was then buried. So I took my crew out of actors, and we basically shot a section or a reenactment of trying to excavate that town. So we re-excavate this sod village on the right side, and various things happen that you can see on the video, including a kind of possession sequence and some kind of graphic interface that records the energy of the Arctic. And on the left side screen, as you look at it, I put a taxidermied caribou sculpture outfitted with cameras, infrared cameras into the body cavity, as well as in the local scrub, and basically ran about a quarter mile of fiber optic sports cable, and we filmed for 24/7 for a week, watching nature take this sculpture over. And so essentially what you see is, a wolf locally kind of come and interact, and you see various things happen. You see the intestines inside that we'd planted expand and grow, and a colony of flies grow and die. And so there are a number of things that happen. It's almost like a clock. So that's a type of clock for me. Something really is happening, but there's this kind of speculative premise. The agent that it's happening on is totally outside of nature. It's not ever going to be absorbed by nature. So it has no role, but all of these forces are trying to interact with it. On the other side, we have something quite the opposite. We have an architectural, not a landmark, but that's something that's been meant to be provisional, that has become something very real to the locals. The kids would all hang out there. It's very graffitied. It's where you go smoke and drink and hang out.
Yeah, I feel like that collaborative aspect is something that maybe is less known but really important, and maybe that's a way to talk about the student groups that you worked with on the DMZ site for the other video that's also being screened here.
Yeah, absolutely. So another of the videos that appears is again a multi-channel work. I have to qualify it that all of these works are actually physically installed as multi-channel works on various walls and planes. So your body is actually a big agent in it. I think for here I've created these kind of more simulations edits. And what we have in the DMZ video that we'll play is basically I'm working with a group of school children, and it's a document of the making of a monument that I was asked to make for the DMZ. And when I was asked, I was like, I don't want to make a monument. There's no way I'd be interested in making a monument of something that I have a very still growing kind of understanding of, and don't feel qualified to kind of memorialize, let alone making a monument that's supposed to be forever, right? However, as we kind of got the opportunity presented itself more, I realized we could make this in the DMZ, in this Peace Plaza, which still requires military escort. So there's a chance to make a monument inside of a place that no one could access, effectively something that's for the future maybe, something that identity will change as everything else changes. And so along the video itself is almost a documentation of that process. And what I did was work with a local group of school children, again, being interested in the community that actually grows up around a DMZ area. This school kids who live on the edge of Charon, which is next to the CCZ, which is the civilian control zone, which is then next to the actual DMZ. There's a little bit of a buffer before the border. But the Peace Plaza itself is an area the kids can't normally access. And it's actually like a few hundred yards from the physical DMZ, which is, in a way, the world's largest
nature preserve.
Nature
right?
preserve, yeah. All these guns pointed at over the heads of these animals and flora and fauna that have been protected. And so with the kids, basically, we went along a site on the Hantan River where my mother crossed in 1948. And we talked about land and geology and place, and we talked about how geologies and things can change in our lifetime. And one of them is, in terms of scale, saltation, which is basically a term used to describe the way that pebbles move down a stream. And so we started collecting volcanic rock fragments along the river that ostensibly could have come from speculative volcanoes in the north and moved down south. So after collecting hundreds of these specimens and talking with the kids about this, what it means to live in the land, what their existence is like, and what they think of their place there, we scanned every sample and then made a mashup, like made a digital kind of model that then became this larger...
It's like a large-scale piece.
Scale piece, yeah. So the piece itself goes through a couple of actions, so scanning with the kids, but also a couple of things that were important sub-actions, and one was this playing of this game called Tankamoki. And so I had the kids, again, while we were collecting the stones, use those stones to play this children's game. It's like hopscotch or something, but essentially it's like a land grab game where the kids throw rocks to define territories, and they try to encompass and eat the other territories of the other kids. So it's basically they're all competing for territory and land and space.
It's a land grab with stones that came from North Korea, essentially.
Exactly, and it's done on one of the bridges that's actually of 3 bridges at this particular site, which is a bridge that was first built, again by the south, and then built by the north, and then completed when the forces were pushed upwards by the U.S. Corps of Army Engineers. So the identity of these sites is always meandering and changing, and yet they're bridges. So I had the kids play the game on one of the bridges, and then transported them or got them permission to go into the site where the monument would be, where they then reenact the game at scale in the DMZ area, just a few hundred yards from the border. And that territory that they drew at larger scale with the rocks, those were all mapped as part of that monument. So that new map, defined by the scanned rocks of the project, became the piece itself.
So it's kind of like a hidden transgression, or...
Yeah, it's kind of a hidden transgression, and it's something you can't access, so I thought it was okay or fitting to make a document that just isn't the piece itself, but is adjacent to whatever identity it has right now.
What's being shown now, I think this is based on something a little closer to home in Pennsylvania, right?
Yeah,
a
this
mine
is
there.
basically, I got invited to go with a local geologic survey of energy in Pennsylvania into one of the coal mines called Rosebud, a local coal mine, and basically went with this crew down into the coal mine, several miles down into the ground, and kind of illegally filmed some of the, travel and descent into that area. Again, it's like super experimental. It was never meant to be footage for a video, but I put it together to kind of, like a lot of these video works that I've done, use to kind of document. Also, they are video works in themselves, but I haven't shown them, for instance, in many cases. And so this is a descent into the mine, and what's important to me is seeing the kind of mine fractured, the compression of space, and all of the kind of mechanics and action that's done under that kind of pressure moving upwards.
And I know in the case of showing it here, you were interested in some of the formal qualities of, say, the billboard being this horizontal landscape, but then that up and down descent or ascent within the video too as like a point of tension, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the idea that you're extracting in layers, kind of following and working with the way that land is formed, the way that those geologic columns are formed, but also then effectively removing the underpinnings that stabilize it. It's always kind of fascinating to me that by the very nature of what that extractive process is, you're destabilizing everything above. And so I wanted to be there in that space and kind of work with that. There are also a lot of fossils within that site, which I was super interested in actually kind of getting exposed to, and also interested again in the reality of community that lives or works and depends on that livelihood of going subterranean, to kind of experience, their landscape in this other way.
And what about kind of how the video interacts with this piece? In a sense, it's being shown on another material that's been extracted from the land, and you have this almost image of the stone being projected onto the stone.
Yeah. I thought that the image of the stone being processed is something that was really, resonant for me, and the chance to show it here. I mean, dealing with something where I feel like I want to discuss and open up conversation about things that are extractive while acknowledging the fact that this is an extractive process is always kind of a tricky one in a way. And I think it's important rather than shy away from the use altogether, acknowledging the fact that this is extractive and this comes from industry. This marble mine basically was used to build a lot of the architecture of empire. It's this marble from this mine, which has been excavated since the mid-19th century, continuously. About a mile and a half in was used to build the U.S. Supreme Court building, the UN buildings, the Beinecke Rare Books Library at Yale, and buildings in Taipei like the Chiang Kai-shek Memorial. And so it has this kind of different resonant, movement. But it's also been used for, many of the millions of fine homes, I think, all across the countertops of Connecticut and such. So
Many kitchens in Chelsea.
Many kitchens in Chelsea, and so it's important to me to acknowledge that too. It's rerouting some of that route, paralleling with that, and seeing something else in that was also something I think important, with a bit of tongue-in-cheek, even though it's really, for me, deals with a really large, deeper time. I think how we access it is only through what we know, and
Yeah, which also feels maybe quite insidious, but also kind of what it is of that we're dealing with, something that's geologic time that goes well beyond human history, but it's also a material that, as you said, kind of represents power and civic institutions, but also is something that is very familiar on a day-to-day level too. And I think it's kind of amazing how you can point to all those things, with just literal material facts. Or I think you mentioned that, intentionally using the cross-cut of it. So when the lights are on without the video, you can actually see, the saw or those traces of its making.
Yeah, exactly. It's important to me to see not the hand, but the processes that extracted it and how it comes from the factory, how it comes from the mine, as well as then this interaction with it or intervention on the back surface, which, like you were pointing out, although we have a lot of acceptance and acquiescence to it from that mining industry, it's been, I mean, you can't usually buy these things retail, but because of our relationship from some past projects, I can get access to these pieces, but essentially you're buying it, right? So there is a kind of, there's no illusion about that, but the idea of the interaction being a refusal of the image that you can see in it, and its placement being a little above that functionality is important to me.
You've worked with the quarry for this long. It's not like a one-off. There is a history there. Are you really understanding where the marble comes from? I don't think we would have been able to do this piece without your prior experience either.
No, that's true. Yeah. To be able to mobilize a slab of marble, at a short time period and get it down here, in order to do that is like, it took some kind of knowledge and some kind of sustained engagement. But it's another thing, and I'm glad you brought it up, that is important about, and maybe resonant, for me at least, in this show, and the idea of refusals and the idea of really examining place is, I'm a part of a big circuit of doing, with many international artists, are biennials, and doing biennials that are so kind of locally, connected, and oftentimes content is connected. There's so much parachuting in of taking an impression of a space and then creating artwork of that local concern and then getting out that is problematic to me as well. So I think that these sustained engagements is really important with the project and sites, and I think that starts to me, open up territory of how it's not, there's a lot of discussion about the difference between site and place, I think, over the years, and I'm sure you could all, just with those words, come up with your own. But I think, one thing that opens it up for me within the experience of my ability or, to have the privilege to do those things, to get to comment and respond in those environments, is to look at what a sustained engagement might be and how that might create a transition of a site that's dispassionate and abstract into a living, existing place that is, experienced over time. So I work with these guys at the mine, and they know what I'm looking for. I know what I'm looking for. I find out things from them, and I ask them to do things they can't do. And so there is a different kind of reaction. And with the Charon community, we continue that dialogue with the children. We continue that kind of work within that monument as well, because it's continually changing. I just had to move it the other day, fly up there and recite the piece within that plaza, because there is some kind of new official function or governmental action. And so even within that space that no one can access, there's a politic as well. So, and I wouldn't know that if I was dropping a piece down there and walking away.
You make it sound so easy to move a monumental sculpture in the DMZ. Maybe we can open it up if there's questions from the audience.
I have a quick question. For the size of this piece and the aspect ratio, does this represent a unit of how they take marble from the ground, and or did you cut it to a size? Is there any meaning, in terms of the dimensions or anything like that?
Yeah, I like these proportions.
Oh yeah. Okay.
But I think that there is a standard, and some previous works have really gone to standard. In other works that I've done with the marble, I'm interested in taking that, like I was mentioning, the contiguous space, so that what we see is basically what represents all of that displaced block, right? So in this case, I had a chance to, I'll backtrack. When we cut an irregular cut face out, there's this incredible variation. That variation can change the weight of the marble by 2,000 pounds. And so in a way, I was always more interested in that. I was interested in the drama within the physical surface landscape, and it's really pointing to the extractiveness. Here, I really wanted to be about pictorial space. And so I thought, why can we just cut it at a certain ratio that won't fit a 16:9, won't fit a 4:3, but it's basically more like a billboard. So there was some more aesthetic license, and I cut it out of a larger piece, but it was asking them to flex a little bit, because they were they normally wouldn't leave it like that or cut it like this. So, so it's a little out of bounds, but it's not really like I'm creating a revolutionary ask of them. But yeah, I think for me, there was more of an aesthetic license in it, and yeah.
Anyone else? Well, thank you, Michael. This was super enlightening. I want to thank everybody for coming out as well.
Yeah, thank you.